So as you can see, the theme of my workshop is critical, compassionate, and creative thinking in the teaching of English. And the reason why I chose this title has to do with the fact that any of the things that I was talking about in the keynote have to do with some degree of thinking as well. So thinking in a wider sense of the word. It seems to me there's a reflective element to dealing with what we're moving into in the 21st century. And so there are three things I would like to do with you in the remaining time. To clarify what these three C's mean to me and to sort of see whether that resonates with you. To think a little bit about, if the three C's are important, what stands in the way? Why isn't it something that why is it something we have to talk about, I feel? Actually make it a topic. And how can we build them into our English teaching? But I actually think that so many of you are also teachers of other languages, any kind of language teaching that we do. Let me just perhaps try and share with you the essence of what I see of the three thinking modes, and start perhaps with critical thinking. For me, at the heart of critical thinking lies questioning. In particular, questioning what we sort of got used to, the things around us. There's a lot of social conventions, what we eat, what we buy, how we shop, what we do, including in our classes. A lot of truisms about. It's interesting, sometimes I have a problem with the word common sense, and I think Albert Einstein said once that, common sense is a collection of prejudices you've collected by the age of 18. And I think that speaks to me a little bit because, kids are socialized into a way of thinking, which is good, but it needs, from time to time, a reflective distance, a stopping ourselves and looking around saying, is this what I want? Is this what we need? Is this what should happen? Just to give one example, because I was struck when I saw this sign in the UK. Any idea why I found this sign interesting? If you just have a quick buzz with the person next to you. If it's three of you, you can be three. If it's 4, 2, 2. Have a look at this sign. Why do you think I took the photo? Just have a quick talk. Come on, we're starting the workshopy part. Can I borrow remember the hand sign, Nikki Hockley? It's very effective. So if you help me, let's practice. It's a new skill, I know. Okay, all right, anybody who would make a suggestion? This is your speaking time as well. Come on, be brave. Yeah?
First of all, what does contract class? How should it pass? Second, why should toddlers not babies? Why not families and parents?
Okay.
Where's the mother?
Wow, there's a lot that you see there. Yeah?
Where's the mother?
Yeah. So what is a family? And I don't know myself, but I do look around and I see so many different families. Yeah? And it's a sort of a slow change, and it's an uncomfortable one. In Hungary now, this is a big topic. And I really appreciate the difficulty of including social systems, but to say, let's go back to the family as we know them, I'm not sure is the way forward. Okay? So that's one way of questioning. And it's nice to see that sometimes that already has led to some sort of change. Creative thinking. I don't know, maybe if your students are like mine, there's a sort of Da Vinci sort of reflex. I'm not creative. I'm not creative. And they say, why not? I can't paint, and I can't sing, and I don't write poetry. That's not what, for me, is the important part of creative thinking, but a playfulness that you allow yourself to develop. And for me, for students, that is actually to feel encouraged and ready to express something they're not sure about, to think out loud in class. That could be a grammar point, or it could be an idea about a topic that you're teaching. But to encourage thinking out loud and clarifying as you think is actually a creative act. If you went to Nikki Hockley's session, that was very interesting. I think what she did at the beginning was exactly that, making the brain looking at things differently. You know, when she used those quotes, those of you who were there, and what did she call it? The remixing thing. That is a creative thing. And it's also, it energizes you. So it's an interesting thing that creativity with it doesn't just bring a better way of thinking, it actually is a way of what somebody called in a workshop yesterday, I think Tony Durr, engagement. So we killed several birds with one stone. If I put it in one word, compassionate thinking is about caring. I think I talked quite a lot about that in my keynote, that the realization that what we do and what we don't do very often affects others in some fashion, has to sink in and actually has to move, and I'll come back to that when we talk a little bit more about compassionate thinking, move from thinking to action in some form. Okay, now there's some good news for you, actually, because I did a bit of research and I found out that everybody has already these three kinds of thinking in them, all of you here. And there's evidence. You just have a look at your hand. Okay, it could be your left or your right. You see those lines? Have a look. Okay. Okay. Back into your groups or pairs. If you see them, what do they mean to you? Which element of creative or critical or compassionate is very much you? What does this mean to you? Okay. And perhaps which one is the strongest? Because I'm not suggesting that they're all equally strong at us. I think of myself as a fairly compassionate person. I think my compassionate thinking is very, very strong, stronger than perhaps the others. So, do you see them? What do they mean to you? And which one, if at all, would you say is dominant a little bit in you? Go. I think what Nikki didn't say yesterday was, when you put up your hand, you also have to stop talking. So you can't do that. And I apologize if I cut you a little bit short. I'm still trying to get a feel for you. So I'll try to pitch it right in terms of how long I would like you to talk and give you a chance to actually share your views. I hope I get better. Can we just have a quick check? How many of you would say critical thinking is a dominant element of? Thank you. What about creative? Interesting, sort of third. Compassionate? Majority. Huh. Okay, you're in the wrong workshop. No, you're not.
That's why we're because so creative.
Oh, I see. You're not creative enough. No, thanks for that. Let me just add a few things to what I said, was for me the essence. So we had questioning, caring, and playfulness. I think I said questioning is in part about questioning what goes on around us, both in relationships, the things that are happening in our daily routines. But it's also about me questioning myself to kind of develop a self-critical stance. What my wife always calls autopilot. If I get in, for example, there's certain patterns of work that are not good for me. I know that, but it's very difficult. I need feedback to get me out of autopilot. Sometimes there's no one around you to tell you. So you need to kind of develop an intuition for when you're moving into an unquestioned mode of being with your partners, if we're talking about relationships. In class, we need to all cut corners, and the routines are important, but why am I doing what I'm doing? I've been doing this now for 10 years. Yeah, so there's a self-critical element for me that's very important here. And the fact, I don't know, Hungary, I don't want to overgeneralize, but there is something that I find difficult after so many years. There is a sense very often when we talk, and we have good talks, with a sort of shoulder shrugging, you can't do anything. It doesn't matter. Uwe, come on. Wake up. And I don't like that. I come from East Germany, and also, so I feel like saying, no, even if you're right, we shouldn't accept it. Even if there's very little we can do. In Hungarian, actually, there's a saying, we're just small potatoes. So it's actually in the psyche, very much, culturally speaking. So this idea, no, critical thinking in the sense of critical, important, it matters what I do and what I think. Caring is interesting because there's sort of a sense of, I love everyone, it's kind of nice. But actually caring really well means to decenter. And, as busy as we all are, to find the time to move away from the needs of the moment that I feel, to make space, emotional space, thinking space for someone else whose needs I perceive, but maybe I'm two minds about whether I should respond to them. So that, again, that's an effort that's involved here. Playfulness, I said, what somebody called ordinary creativity. In teaching, sometimes to think for me, what if? So I always start the class this way. Why didn't I start differently? Donald Schoen, one of my heroes, educationists, once said, he called it, do something different and see if you like it, as a way of learning from the feedback. If you're an experienced teacher, you don't worry so much about what happens, but you may not know what the effect of this is. And I think that's also true for students. And I would argue that those of you who were at the keynote, the idea of actually shifting perspectives is actually another creative act. To be able to see something that somebody else sees involves imagination to a certain extent. This is the what. And I hope we're sort of on the same page for the time being. What stands in the way? What makes it difficult for these three things not just to be there, but actually we're talking about them, and I certainly do, that I need to develop them in myself, and I'd like to develop them in my students. So, let's try a different mode. I'm very happy that we have a whiteboard.
You're also not knowing yourself well enough to know, is this really me?
You can't behave like this, or if you have in class.
Can I add that here? Yeah, so self-esteem, self-knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah, this kind
I
of
would
stuff.
like to add knowledge in general, because very often the knowledge of the rules is compared to the perceived rules. And if you knew the actual authority, the rules, the laws, what's behind standardization, you wouldn't feel limited by it, because they're not as limiting as they're perceived.
So it's a bit like fake rules.
Yeah,
from the body. Okay.
What's being read about these is very different from what's actually in the original text.
Okay. Okay. If you let me close the list for now. Now, there's one, actually, I would suggest one that sort of sits atop several of these, but I think it's a powerful force related to several. And to make that point, I would like you to decide in your groups, what do you think is going on? Who is speaking? Where? I know, if you're my generation, you know, perhaps. Where? What's going on? Come on, quick buzz. Not everybody knows, I'm sure. You have to be a certain age to know. And like films. Can't see this very well, but it'll be a little better in a minute. So what is it? A film? Dead Poets Society. Right? And it's an interesting scene, which kind of is quite powerful. And as you watch, I'd like you to see what point is the teacher making. If you haven't seen the film in particular, if you did see it, try to remember. Okay? Okay, so the key word is, for me, conformity. That I would add, and that I think sort of runs across several of these. Bernard, I have only permanent markers. I'll deal with that later. It's a colourful conformity. Here we go. It's okay. Yeah. So I think in the lecture, in the keynote, I actually talked about affinity bias, those of you who were there. So this is a key example. So what he called the need for acceptance is very, very big in all of us, not just kids. And to swim against the stream sounds great. But it's very difficult. If you just think if we think of ourselves, not so much of our students even. What does that mean in the current climate that we live through? Some of the things that, when I talk to colleagues over dinner, things that concern them, they're not sure how to act politically, socially, environmentally. How do you swim against the stream? So this conformity pressure is a force to reckon with. And it's interesting, I've sort of introduced the clip in the way that I actually introduce it with my students as well, to ask the students what conformity is. And I use an acrostic. And this is one of the things that they came up with, very interesting. And it leads to discussion if you want, if you have time to make that discussion. Maybe it's part of a wider topic. But it's also a kind of sometimes, how shall I put it, self-inflicted conformity. So I would say the power of conformity is one thing that's key. Habitual ways of seeing and doing things is another. So pressure from the outside, perceived or real. You gave some really good examples. We do live in a real world of our schools and societies. Habitual ways, meaning that we kind of got used to consider people or the things we do in a certain way, which is comfortable, but lets us not see alternative ways of acting upon them. And something I'll come back to later, which is called selective empathy. It seems that we are choosy with our compassion, our ability to be compassionate. Okay, now, so I just wanted to kind of clear the ground a little bit conceptually so that you will see why I'm doing what I'm going to do with you next, which is perhaps the even more practical part of this workshop. So I'm going to introduce a couple of ways in which I've been working that, in my view, have helped me deal with what stands in the way issues, and slowly sort of chisel away or working on the issue of how to encourage critical, creative, and compassionate thinking. Because ultimately, I want a move from thinking to doing. Okay? And to see how I can do that with my students has been very inspiring and sobering, but also exciting. Okay, let's do something quite simple. I think it was Michel who talked a little bit about, what do we know? 21st century, China is growing. They are learning English, I know that. But more and more people are learning Chinese for all sorts of reasons. I don't know whether it's like in Austria, but in Hungary it's a big way. There's more and more minor students, or they actually combine their studies. Increasingly, China is visited by people who want to learn from China. I'm involved in one such project. If we just take the number of speakers in China, of English now, that's already a force. So China will soon become the #1 English-speaking country in the world. I'd like you to challenge that statement. Okay? Can you come up with, individually, you might want to write that down, just each of you, 2 questions that would challenge that statement or question that statement? Because this sounds like, wow, that's something else. So think for a moment. If you would like to get into this development more, what kind of question could you ask? I have about 8, but I'll let you start individually with 2, and then I'd like you to see if you have similar question, or you can come up to my 8. Okay? So 2 questions each. Before you talk, just write them down on a piece of paper. How can you question that statement? And once you've got your 2, check with your partners and see what they've got. Before I show you my own, can we shout out a few questions? Obviously, don't repeat the question that's been asked. Let's just see what range and quality of questions we get. Someone's to... You have to project.
What do you mean by soon?
Thank you. Go.
How do you define an English-speaking country?
Interesting.
Which Chinese are you talking about?
Ah,
Your social spectrum,
okay. Do you mean socially speaking, yeah, in society? Excellent.
You want the same on
Yep.
both.
You only have one? No.
They have a strong
Why is it
accent.
relevant to us? Why is it relevant to us?
Okay.
Do they have a strong accent?
Will they have a strong accent? Okay. Excellent.
Why are they so motivated to learn the language?
Very good.
Then where are they going to get all the teachers from?
Brilliant. Uh-huh. Where will they get the teachers from to teach all these people English?
Will they really be able to pass India? Because in India, as a former colony, almost everybody speaks English. India has more than 1 billion people.
And the demography is changing. They're actually growing faster now.
Exactly.
I was wondering who says that.
Yeah? Where does it come from? Okay. You're very good. Here's my list. Yeah, there's a, when this was enacted, is that all to Chinese people? I mean, it's chopsticks and rice. And, interesting. So, I mean, if questioning lies at the heart of critical thinking, surely to ask good question is a skill that students need to develop, and meaning both in the terms of grammatically speaking, but also what makes a good question. Your questions were great questions, right at the heart of what the Chinese are grappling with right now. And they can sense it too. But because they are under a lot of pressure, for all sorts of reasons, this only comes out when you talk individually and you work with teachers or lecture at universities, as I do now. So that's interesting, and I think maybe you can also see the connection with the sort of, what does that remind you of? The Trumpian, the greatest. But this is the best, the greatest, the most. How do you, where do you, and
It doesn't need an evidence.
right, yeah. So for me, that's an important part of developing that kind of critical thinking. And actually, so you can maybe think a little bit about what kind of statements would work for your students in the work, in the topics that you deal with, because you don't need much. You need an interesting statement. You need to make sure that students have the ability to formulate a question. Maybe they need help linguistically from you to formulate it before they share it, but you do it in a group, so that also is a bit of a checking device. And then let's hear it, and maybe pick one to follow up on. You can also do this with a text. So I'm going to share another technique with you that goes in a Similar direction. Okay, I think you're activated enough. Okay, here's the story. Two monks were traveling together. And at some point, they got to a river with a very strong current. And as they were about to cross, they saw a woman who looked very worried and was also attempting to cross. When the woman noticed the two monks, she asked them if they could help her. So one of the monks put her on her shoulder and carried her across the stream and put her down on the other side. The other monk was very upset, but he didn't say anything. They walked on. After a while, the first monk said, "Do you know, what's the matter? You seem very upset." And his friend said, "Well, you know that as monks, we're not allowed to touch women. I mean, have contact with them, let alone touch them. So how could you have put this woman on your shoulders?" And the first monk said, "Well, you know, I put this woman down an hour ago, but you are carrying her still." Okay. I'm going to make this now a group challenge to all of you. I would like you to find 20 questions to ask about this story. Any questions are allowed. I'm not going to sort of start commenting, but I will count. So each time you give me a question, I cross it out, and you cannot repeat a question. That's the only thing. And we'll see if we can get to 20 questions.
Where is the story set? Where is the story set? Why were the monks traveling? Why were the monks traveling? Why does the woman need to cross the river?
Why are monks not allowed to touch women?
Why one monk not here?
You're doing well.
Can monks help in an emergency? Can monks carry a woman?
Yeah, can they help in an emergency? Can they break rules in an emergency?
How old is the woman though? How old? What about the age of
How old is the woman?
Yeah,
Okay.
how old is the woman?
Fair enough. You know,
Yeah.
Why did you take?
I think you've been waiting.
Why does the one monk even worry about carrying the woman across?
Why did the second month wait an hour until they started talking about it? Why did it take them so long?
Point taken.
What happens if monks touch women?
When the other monk crossed the river.
When or how?
When did the other monk, the one who wasn't carrying the woman?
What happens in their mind?
Go.
What happens in their mind if they don't touch women?
Your question.
Which faith do the monks have? Which
Yeah, because we don't know. It could be Christian, any. Good one.
In which period of history is this story set?
5 to go.
How heavy is the woman? Who's the author of the story?
You're getting creative now.
Why are they for monks? Where did they want to get?
Was the story originally written in English or in another language?
Yay! Well done. Very interesting. What did you notice about the questions? if you notice anything. Maybe you were too much into the story.
I'm not asking any of the stupid comprehension questions that are often used in teaching.
Yes. One thing I noticed, they're all very good questions, in the sense of what I would call probing questions that really go to the heart, and I'll come back to that, of the story. What was funny for me is actually with students, it works the other way around. We kind of end it on, I wouldn't call them superficial questions, because as we were running out of steam, we started looking sort of more factual, how heavy was the woman? Now students usually start out that way. Partly because it's fun to ask a silly question, how was the woman, and was she attractive? That sort of thing. And then you it tends to move that way. Yeah? So, I think that's one of the differences between teachers and students. Okay. Now, one more thing. What do you think is the message of the story? Can you have a very quick talk in your group? It seems to be a parable of some sort again. What is the message? Have a quick talk. So there are two ways to go with students. One is that actually to give them a choice first, of saying, of the questions, which of the questions that were actually really interesting questions? Choose one of the 20. They usually remember one or two that were interesting to them. And they're not the ones, is she attractive or how much does the woman weigh? And so if students are good at this, to give them that choice of going on in that discussion. If that's difficult, the same question, what does it mean to you? Can you relate this? Has this happened to you in your lives where you got into a conflict of sorts and you had to take a decision? Usually that washes up very interesting things too. There's another thing that you might have, and I think you can actually do this with any kind of text, if you think about it for a moment. As one of you said, what it does do is that it goes way beyond comprehension questions. You still need to make sure that students understand in some fashion, but if you really wanted to go into it and use the text for substance, I found that that's a very nice technique to use from time to time. The other reason why I like it is that maybe you're beginning to see it too, it actually begins to combine thinking. There's a critical thinking element. There's a playfulness in the way we actually do it. Students, after a you get better at asking questions, and also it's interesting to see what people come up with. And because it's a group challenge, you don't feel put on the spot. And you get creative. Question making of the kind that you've just done is a creative feat. So I'm particularly interested in things where I can bring the 3 different thinking modes into one. Instead of saying, now today I'm doing critical and maybe next week I'll do empathetic or whatever. Compassionate. So just to remind ourselves, so what stands in the way? Power of conformity, habitual ways of seeing, naming, selective empathy. The story is an interesting example of selective empathy. So, the monks would be very happy to be very empathetic and compassionate with fellow monks. Who would they not be ready to help in a very practical way? For what reason? I'm not just talking about monks here. Maybe you know this guy, but even if you don't know him, he's called Jim, which is true. Can you just shout out a couple of words that you would associate with him? Come on, adjectives. Here we go.
Respectable.
Smart.
Well-dressed.
For sure. Yeah, you're better than me with a... Polite.
Respectable.
Respectable. Thank you. Aggressive. Why would you say that? There's something in his face? Sarcastic. Cheek. What? You're good at I have to look at that. There's something about the mouth, maybe, that if you don't know... Yeah. Let's meet him. It's quite powerful, isn't it? I will tell you later. So, what is compassionate thinking then? in this case.
We judge people. They're outside from our ideas.
That's not the compassionate, but that's basically, we go back to where we were here, yeah? I mean, you see, in this case, a homeless person. That's what you see. You don't see the potential, and you don't see where they're from, you know, how they got. So actually, empathy is like or this kind of compassion means if you meet someone like that and you've got a particular take on them, you would need to redress them, and to look beyond the label that you've got, and in your mind sort of see who they were or could have been or could be. And I think what you noticed in his mouth was correct, or in his face. There was, you know, this is a very, very odd experience for him, but obviously it had a transformative effect on him as a potential that he perhaps didn't think he had left in him. The reason why this is important for me is that I think I said earlier there is something like selective empathy. So it's you know, what happens in my family, I'm super compassionate. My friends, my colleagues, if you have a dog, your dog. So we can reach out, we care, and we're prepared perhaps to do extra in some form. Look after them. It gets harder with strangers, social outsiders, cultural outsiders, people from a different country, even animals. It's different the way you deal with your pet and the way, think of factory farming and things. So the limits of our compassion are kind of interestingly demarcated. And it's interesting that, again, it was Albert Einstein who suggested, in a very nice phrasing, I wonder if he said it in German first, but it's in English, we need to widen the circle of compassion to be able to relate better to the people around us. So to move from the inner circle to be ready to sometimes move into the outer circle.
I think you have to be careful here.
Yes.
Without selective empathy, you end up in hospital in the bed.
Yes.
Especially when you do your job with people.
Absolutely.
I think this is really tricky, how to find this path between compassion and self-centered. And you learn it with age, I think.
I'm really glad you're mentioning this. Yes, it's not that I don't want us to turn into therapists. No. Okay, but the point for me is that maybe even to be selective when I am selective. Yeah, just to give one example, I mean, Hungary has a huge problem with homeless people. I've been supporting someone unsuccessfully for years in our family. But I do find, for example, to stop and talk makes a huge difference to some of them. So apart from whatever money you give, because there's no social contact. Amongst themselves, yes, but you know, even it's in the car, and I talk and I spend. So I know some people by now. That's an empathetic, compassionate, small C, that I think you do, and it doesn't uproot me. Okay, and there others will come to. So. All I'm saying is that again, an imaginative act, trying to put ourselves a little bit into the situation. And actually what Babot is saying, you cannot be that person. We cannot walk around in somebody else's shoes. But the fact that you try already has an effect. And it will probably lead you to some sort of action. So beyond imagining what it's like into, well, what can I do, not to solve the situation or put undue loads on myself, but in small ways, doing something that will matter to the person concerned. And it doesn't have to be homeless people. I just used a rather dramatic example. this is true for students, for people you don't know, as I said, strangers in general. So this idea, not to act in big ways, but to try and see beyond the labels that we're giving people. Once we've categorized somebody as a stranger, a migrant, the whole way people disappear under the label of migrant, despite all the difficulties we have, they have lives. They are actually like me in many ways. The new kid in class. So to just start thinking in that direction, I think, is an important part of developing compassionate thinking. This is one example that I really like. It's a very... Do you want to make a point? Yes?
I just want to say something that I always tell the students before they graduate that they will have to, in a very narrow meaning, also develop compassion. And when they're talking, when they're giving a presentation, they have to always put themselves into the audience's shoes.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, even though the objective is different, but it's also kind of the same outcome, that they are able to step outside themselves and see their own actions through a different perspective and lens. And I think that's very important, because not only will it make them better speakers, but it will also help them in general terms. And I've heard that. But that's what happens.
Thank you. Thanks for that. In Devon, where I also used to do quite a lot of work, this is a primary school. And they have a buddy bus stop. So everybody knows, all the students and the teachers know, that if there's somebody new to the school and they feel lonely, or somebody who has a problem, and they don't want to talk about it to the teacher or anyone, if they go to the buddy bus stop, somebody will come, some kid will come, and just say, "I'm Mark. What's your name? How are you?" That's a very interesting opening. No more, no less. I mean, I'm not sure the kid can solve the problem necessarily, but just to make that move from maybe the kid who walks up there imagining what it was like when he entered the class, and then taking the action of just being there with the other kid, already I think, I would argue, makes a big leap forward. With your students, you don't need a buddy bus stop, but maybe a buddy system is a similarly act. Saying, we've got somebody new coming in, who would look after them a little bit? I don't want you to do extra, but just, can you socialize a little bit? Just, see how they are, ask if you can help. So, again, it's not the act of what we actually do, but to think in this direction. And then I think we will get ideas. Maybe you remember this picture from the keynote. And this is actually another story of compassionate thinking. And the way I use it is the way I'm going to use it with you. Now we need A's and B's. I don't want to overcomplicate it. If there's three of you, one of you could just do nothing, okay, for the time being, because I can't move you around. But let's say if we have, can you make sure there's an A and a B at each table where there are three? And one of you just enjoys the moment, you're kind of an observer. Can I suggest that you are, because you need to be doing something and you're with your back to, yeah? But you can also move out so you can see. In a minute I will show. Okay. A's, can I show the hands of A's? Can I see the hands of A's? B's? Brilliant. Okay. Now A's, this is a moment of relaxation. I'd like you to close your eyes. You can trust nothing bad's happening at all. I'd just like you to close your eyes, because your B's will tell you the story. Okay? Is that okay? So A's, close your eyes. Okay, then I change my question. At your table, what is the message? If there is a message. Can you have a quick talk? What is the message? If the same... Would you like to have another go?
No, I'm fine now that my friends explain everything.
Well, how... no, that's fine. So how did they explain it to you?
Well, actually, what I did not understand is that there was this one ginger-haired boy that used to be blonde before, so he obviously dyed his hair to support this one other ginger boy, and the other one put up a hat that was orange in support of showing.
I'm not sure it was in support of showing.
It was just showing him that ginger hair is a category. That's what was particularly. Yes, he took it off again. That's why I didn't understand the thing in the first place, but then you said.
Well, it was a case of bullying, wasn't it? In an interesting sort of way. There was a bit of physical, nothing too, but clearly the ginger-haired boy was standing out. What do you get bullied for? What do you get bullied for? Glasses? Just being different. Yeah. So it doesn't matter. It was his hair. We don't know. Okay. And the interesting thing is the other boy. Again, we don't know. He didn't do much else. He just. What did he do with this? He dyed his hair. But what did he do with that? So.
Because he's an older one like the other one.
Right.
The first boy was a younger one.
That's right. He empowered him because suddenly the power differential changed. Because that's a guy they're taking seriously. If he's in, then affinitive bias sort of works positively for a moment. Yeah. Okay. So I think it's an interesting clip that, without many words, makes the point about the arbitrariness of bullying, but also sometimes because students are rightly worried about, well, what do I do? I don't want to get into a fight, I'm not sure exactly how, I don't like what I see. And sometimes it just takes an act of kindness, sending a signal. Go.
Can the A's in the movie?
Can they?
Can the A's like we see?
Of course, they usually do anyway. They say, yeah, this was good, I understood, but can we see it as well? Yeah. But the telling is an interesting language part. So if students have part, they do it afterwards, to telling the story, processing a way of understanding the story as you see it. Okay. And I'll come back to that in a minute, to the sources. Don't worry, I've got, and you've got them anywhere in the PDF. So what I'd like to leave you with is then, from the point of view of compassionate thinking, for all of us, and to include our students in this, to kind of look how, in smaller ways, we can contribute to a culture of kindness. And I like this phrasing, random acts of kindness. You don't have to prepare, but if you're perceptive, you see somebody's unwell, you know somebody's treated not right, the students begin there, then it can be an apple that somebody shares with a person who they know is not usually related well to in the class. It doesn't have to be any. So a random act of kindness is a small act of kindness. So what I would invite you to, the conference is not over, maybe think of a random act of kindness at this conference. Right here, right now, in the remaining time. I'm sure if you start thinking about it, you can think of something. The same way in schools, amongst colleagues, with students. And where you live. The people that you don't normally meet, other than Grüß Gott. Okay. So to finish off on what I was trying to show beyond the point of what, for me, critical and creative and compassionate thinking are, is that I'm particularly happy if I can combine them. So if they were T-shirts, I don't know if we have to change the T-shirt, but have one T-shirt that kind of allows me to keep my critical, creative, and compassionate antenna working, and to find ways of acting on it. Okay? Here's some of the sources that I've been using. I think I mentioned this in the keynote. There's fantastic sources under the IETFL GSIG. The clip that you've just seen, and also I think Jim, are part of what's called lesson inspirations, e-lesson inspirations. So you have 4 lesson plan ideas for how you might want to use this clip with your students, from a language learning point of view as well as from a thinking point of view. Okay. And this is an interesting book that I can recommend too. I think this, wasn't it Michelle who also talked about teaching as a subversive activity? Yeah. Here's some really practical ideas for what that might mean in small ways. Again, nothing to cause a revolution, but to do things differently in the way that I've encouraged creativity and critical thinking today. And there's a small article I wrote with my wife. We share a lot of things about this topic, which is also available online. So I think it's time to thank you. Thanks for being a great audience, and enjoy the rest of the conference. It's been really nice meeting you. Thank you.